Practicing the Way course is a primer on spiritual formation. It's designed to lay a foundation for you to begin a lifelong spiritual journey of apprenticeship to Jesus. Over 8 sessions, you will hear teaching from myself and other voices on spiritual formation. We'll cover things like what it means to be an apprentice of Jesus, intentional spiritual formation, the practices of Jesus, and more. Join us on the Practicing the Way course.
Thanks for joining us. If you're watching from home, thanks for joining us today. We kick off a new series this month called Generosity. So we're talking about the things that Jesus said about generosity. Now, I just want to give a disclaimer right now. This is something I have never talked on. And I'm going to get into why that. It's just one of those subjects that have never come up. It has come across my path in the past few years because God has been teaching me something about being generous and challenging my own level of generosity. But really, to acknowledge where we're going today, what we're going to say in the beginning and the end is that to be generous or to become generous, we've got to practice generosity. And so, therefore, in order to become more generous, we need to talk about generosity. Now, 25% of what Jesus talked on and what Jesus talked about was generosity. If you go back in the New Testament and the Gospels, 25%, 1/4 of Jesus' teaching was on this subject. It's amazing that it hasn't crossed my path, but being a youth minister for 25 years is not something that would come up a lot. And he talked about being generous not only with your time, your resources, investing in people. I mean, he said things like we're going to get in today, like the treasures in your heaven, the treasures in your heart, that kind of thing. And he also talked about money. And so while generosity is not primarily about money, it'd be naive to not say that it is aimed at money, and this is what Jesus talked about. Now, before we go forward, I know what this might make you feel like, at least I can guess, because I've been in your shoes before, and I've sat under pastors and heard them preach on money and generosity and that kind of thing. And so I just want to acknowledge how generosity kind of makes us all feel, because someone talking about this is really going to challenge you, because it's going to challenge you in a lot of different places. And so you may have a mixed bag of emotions. In fact, you might just probably want to turn this one off and you say, I don't want to hear that one. That's one message I don't need right now. And so let's just acknowledge some of the feelings you might have listening to me. First, it's awkward. It's awkward, right? You think, oh no, here comes the money talk. Rusty's going to ask for more money. And while we are a nonprofit and we exist off your giving, that's what this feels like. And that's what it feels like to me. Or maybe you get defensive. Why do they need my money? I mean, I work hard for it. Or you feel some sort of guilt. I probably should give more, but I just can't right now. And they're going to put pressure on me to give more money. Or there's suspicion. Isn't this just kind of tied in, with budgets and raising money? And isn't this just kind of a cool way to kind of motivate us to give more? Or maybe you come from a place of fear. If I give it, well, I have enough for myself. I mean, I don't already have enough to make what I'm to live off of, and so I don't really have anything to give away. Or maybe, it's apathy. I don't like this topic. This topic really doesn't apply to me. I'm just going to tune this out. Or maybe you are excited. I love generosity, and I can't wait to hear more. And so I want to talk about a little bit about my feelings, because I want you to understand that I'm coming from a different place, or coming from the same place as you. And so here is kind of my feelings about this as we go forward. For instance, as we talk about this stuff, one of the things that we need to understand is that, hold on, let me find my place. My first feeling about this is I dislike it, okay? This is not, I think maybe one of the reasons why I haven't preached on it is because I don't like the awkward feeling that I get talking about money with you. Because when I went into ministry, like when that 19-year-old decided, okay, God's called me into ministry and I want to go into ministry, it never was about budgets. It never was about fundraising or deficits or payroll or any of that stuff. I never saw ministry as oh, I can't wait to go into ministry and one day, I'm going to have a private jet, right? That was never my intention. And so please put that aside. We can't pass the offering plate, but if you were here, we're not going to pass it twice. My feelings is I dislike this. I don't like this. Even when I talk to the elders about money, it's my least, I don't enjoy this part of it. And so that's probably one of the reasons why I haven't talked about generosity. I didn't go into ministry to get rich. I mean, nobody that I know in my family who's in ministry is making a lot of money. And if they did, you need to be aware of that. Some pastors just living rich and not living a normal life. So that's just kind of my feelings about it. Your feelings also, you have to acknowledge this, come from three places. They come from your family of origin, they come from your social status, and they come from church teaching. Now let's just talk about your family of origin, and I'm going to talk about mine for a moment. Your parents, and this is not to diss on anybody's parents or mine, but your family of origin, whatever that is, whatever family you grew up in, there was something that was modeled or taught or not taught in your family about money. And it was probably, it wasn't like something your dad or mom said, but it was something that they kind of said on the side, or you heard conversations about back in the day. You would talk about the checkbook. That's not really a thing anymore, but you would talk about the checkbook and budgets and that kind of stuff. And so you have kind of, some of your emotions and feelings, you don't realize it, but they come from that. They come from your social status. Maybe you grew up poor. Culturally, you didn't have as much as other people had, right? Lee and I were talking about that this week, and I remember growing up with like one good pair of everything. One good pair of shoes, one good pair of jeans, and we were kind of joking around about this, and for some reason, as a high schooler, this is so strange, I would save my best outfit for Fridays. Don't know why that was a thing, why I thought that mattered, like I was going to get more attention on a Friday than I was wearing bad jeans on a Tuesday. I don't know. But you could see how money will affect it, because I remember just being kind of a one jean kind of guy. These were my good jeans. In fact, when I was growing up, you really owned two types of clothes. Sinbad says you own your church clothes and your play clothes, right? You put on your church clothes, and when you come home, your school clothes and your play clothes, right? You take off your school clothes, put on your play clothes. Anyway, then maybe some of your feelings about the anxiety that money comes from, or somebody preaching on generosity or something like that, comes from some church teaching you've heard, right? And that church teaching is this. Giving is a transaction. I've got to give to get God to bless me. Now, I'm not saying these are correct teachings. I'm saying these are things you heard. Maybe your church didn't communicate that, but this is what you caught. God wants you to be wealthy. There's a whole theology behind that. Wealthy people are greedy, and money is evil. And so you were kind of guilted into giving. The one that I grew up with hearing a lot is that give it or God will take it away, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So for me, my family of origin, there was a lot of, and I hate to say this, but there was a lot of stinginess in my family. I didn't recognize this until I got older, because that affected my view of my money and how I would spend the money that God had given. It's not my money, but the money that I was making and the money that Lee was making, and we pulled that resource. And so there was that stinginess from my family was passed on, because we never really discussed it. There was no plan for generosity. That was not an ongoing practice, as we're going to get in today. And then my social status is, we were kind of average middle-class family. I talked about just kind of, I didn't really have that much stuff, and everything that I had was like one new thing and one old thing. I bought my own car in high school. I had to work on that and pay for that, and I didn't get that till really I graduated, and it was a 1976 diesel Rabbit, and that was used, and it was falling apart, and I paid for that. And so that kind of was how I felt about money. You know, I make it. This is my money. You know, I work hard for it. And so that kind of affected the way I see generosity. And then the church teaching that I grew up under was this tithe, give 10%, give 10%. Generosity is not about giving 10%. It's not about that. In fact, we're not even going to address that until week 5. We'll talk a little bit about that because it really has nothing to do with that. It's such a small part of the aspect of generosity, but it is a part of it. In most churches, that's what they center around. They center around 10%, 10%. And I would hear stories from pastors who believe this particular brand of theology that said, okay, if you didn't give 10% and you gave 8%, God's going to take the 2% because God's going to take what's his, and his is 10%. And so there was this built-in fear that if I didn't obey God, God was going to take it. And so you can see that our family of origin, our social status, church teaching, this really affects our ability to listen in, lean in to what Jesus had to say about generosity. So for the next 5 weeks, we are barely going to dip our toes in some of the teachings of Jesus on generosity. And without kind of coining a pun here, this is rich. It really is. It's great. I think it's challenging. It's so needed. And I think it's going to kick off the year with a different approach to how we might want to see and practice our Christianity. So if you're curious about what Jesus said about generosity, hang on, because we are going to get to some of that. What did Jesus teach? Now, we're going to divide the next 5 weeks into 4 key teachings that Jesus said. There's so much more that I'm not going to be able to cover, but I think this is pretty much what we need to handle, and if I'll feel led, we might add one more message. But at the end of this, the 5th week, we're going to talk about practical ways that you can practice generosity. And so that'll be left to the end. But the first 4 weeks, here's kind of what we're going to cover. And this is kind of generically, topically titles of what I think where we're going. Today we're talking about it's better to give than receive. You've heard that before. Jesus said that. We're going to talk about that today. Next week, we're going to talk about watch out for greed. Jesus said that. He said, watch out for greed. Another thing he said is that all that we have belongs to God. The idea of stewardship and that God has given this and it's a gift from him and we're to use it for his kingdom and his glory and his purposes, but yet we can participate and enjoy the gifts that God has given us. So we're going to get into that. And then the 4th week, we're going to talk about this idea of being generous to the poor. Jesus had a lot to say about generosity to the poor. And we don't mean government forcing us to pay taxes. We're talking about us having a plan of generosity to give to people who are in need around us. So, in order to begin today, what we're talking about, it's better to give than to receive. If you have your Bible, or if you want to follow along, you should be able to see that we're going to flash the slides up there. You can follow along. We're going to begin with Acts chapter 20, verse 35, with what Jesus said. I'm going to read it, and then we're going to come back to it. And this is Paul speaking, and Paul is speaking about what's going on in a local church, and he's talking about taking some money and taking one money. In fact, during this time, you see that the culture of the Roman Empire, there was a great poverty going on, and so what was happening is these churches were being formed, and as the churches were growing, one church who had a lot of money would take up an offering, and Paul or Barnabas or Mark or whoever was traveling, Timothy or Titus, would take it and give it to another church. And so they were helping other churches. And this is what Paul writes about that. Paul says, "And I have been a constant example of how you can help those in need by working hard. You should remember the words of the Lord Jesus. It is more blessed to give than to receive." Paul is talking to the leaders of the Ephesians church, and he's encouraging them to follow his example of generosity. Now, this is also an example of service. It's also an example of giving time. It's not just an example of giving money, because Paul does talk about working hard. So there is this idea of serving the ministry and participating in the mission of Jesus. But really what he's saying is, and more specifically, is how to care for the poor and needy, or that when we do give to people, we experience this idea of a blessing. And so Paul is emphasizing generosity as a central value in the Christian faith. It's central to us because the idea of giving comes from God. God is a giving God. In fact, we have received forgiveness, which is part of giving, through Jesus. And so everything about salvation, everything about following Jesus is part of this aspect of giving. And he uses the word blessed, which is the Greek word makarios, which is to give. And it means wealthy. It means that this is a good thing. This is a great thing. In fact, Paul is quoting Jesus as the ultimate authority on the matter. For instance, he's raising generosity up to a value. Now, if you've been around me in the past year, you know that I've talked a lot about values. We're just going to keep coming back to it because I think it's a key theme in the New Testament. It's about priorities. It's about how we choose our decisions. And so a value is what someone, something, or some choice is worth to us. A value matters to you, and it's what drives your decision. So Paul is emphasizing why generosity mattered to Jesus. It's better to give than to receive, and why it should matter to us. Now, here's something interesting about this quote and about this verse. First of all, this quote is outside of the Gospels. There are a few places where we have a teaching of Jesus that are not found in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So Matthew and John, who were disciples of Jesus, wrote down their accounts of being around Jesus and hearing the teachings of Jesus, and they accumulated all that teaching using other sources and other narrations as well, and they came up with their story. Matthew tells his story. John writes his account, right? And he tells the story. Mark is actually the account of Peter. So in some ways, the Gospel of Mark is the story of Peter and what Peter had to say about Jesus. And then Luke, when he writes his account, he takes everybody's account. In fact, we think Luke used all the sources. Luke used Matthew, Mark, and John, and pulled from those sources and formed his own source and another outside source called Q. And so you have the central teachings of Jesus in the Gospels, but in other places, like in 1 Corinthians, when you have the Lord's Supper and communion mentioned, you have these other quotes of Jesus. It is better to give than to receive. And the reason why that is because during the early days, there was an oral teaching of Jesus. I mean, you and I, we have a Bible, right? We've had a Bible. I've had a Bible my whole life. If I wouldn't know what Jesus said, I would open up the Bible, I would turn to Matthew or turn to Mark or whatever. But in the early first century church, they didn't have a B-I-B-L-E. They didn't have a Bible to open up and refer to. They had the oral teachings of the disciples, and sometimes the oral teachings of disciples of disciples. John had his own disciples that he taught. And what happened is that they would have sayings of Jesus that were part of the teachings of Jesus that were left out. And this is one of the things that was being taught, but was not taught in the Gospels, but it's quoted to Jesus. So it's a very interesting thing that they're quoting something that you don't find in the Gospels. Paul is saying, listen, I've learned this, and he learned it from he actually studied under the apostles for a while he discipled for about almost 5 or 6 years after he became a believer. He hung out with the disciples in Jerusalem, and he was taught. And so during this time, he heard some oral sayings of Jesus that were not recorded in the Gospels. And one of them is, it is more blessed to give than receive. Now, I want to explain some original meanings of this word, and I've already said that the word blessed means to be wealthy, to be joyful, to be happy. So immediately, Jesus is tying this idea of happiness to generosity. In fact, it's even more than that. What he's explaining to us is that in order for us to experience true happiness, we need to learn why God is generous, because God, who's the source of generosity, teaches us to be generous. And also this word, makarios, comes from this idea that everything has this well-being about it. And in the Greek terminology, in Greek thought, in Greek mythology, it was known as the well-being of the gods. So when Jesus said it's more blessed to give than receive, he's saying, listen, you know what gods have in Greek mythology? They have all the blessings, all the wealth, all the comforts, all the pleasures. That's exactly what generosity produces here on this planet. You get to experience the same blessing of the gods when you, excuse me, give. When you give. Now, this is counterculture. This is countercultural. It's counterintuitive to us because we grew up I grew up in the same culture you grew up in. I still live in the same America you live in. I have the same apps on my phone that you have. I mean, if I get bored, I can go through Amazon and look at my Amazon list as well as you can. I have a list on Target and Walmart and places that I want to buy stuff. So we live in a culture where it's so easy to access that feeling of more. More. Amazon, commercials, and there's a study that by the time you're 10 years old, you've already seen at least almost 30,000 hours of commercials, something crazy like that. If you're like me, there's probably been a period in your life where you've struggled with credit card debt because you let things get ahead and run ahead because you wanted something that you didn't have or you wanted a lifestyle that you didn't have. I've been there. I've done that. I don't know how many times Lee and I have looked at each other and go, why did we buy that? Why are we paying that off now? Why didn't we save for that? So listen, in American culture, I understand. And so that causes us to ask this question. Does Jesus really have the path to true happiness? I mean, is it really more blessed to give than to receive? What are we talking about here? I mean, do I really believe that, or am I going to ignore it? So, social sciences have shown studies that prove that generous people are actually happier, they're healthier, they laugh more, they live longer. In fact, did you know that the feeling of generosity stimulates dopamine? It's the same feeling that I get when I eat my favorite sandwich or my favorite hamburger, or when actually you do something pleasurable in life like making love. It's the same feeling. Generosity produces the same dopamine. And so when Jesus is saying this, he's talking about not just socially, but he's talking about how we feel physiologically. There is a reaction that happens in us. And what the paradox of generosity is that we think that more money and more stuff is going to make us happy. And Jesus is saying, no, actually the opposite. When you are generous, you will experience the same pleasure as buying stuff, as purchasing something new or something you've always wanted or something you've saved up for. And I think the problem with that is that we've not practiced, at least in my own life, generosity enough to know what that feels like. And so the goal of this series is to change that, at least to get us stepping in that direction, to let this become a practice of our faith, because it's something that Jesus taught. And believe me, as a follower of Jesus, I want to do everything that Jesus says, because I believe that whether I don't practice it or not, or I struggle with doubting or not, I believe that Jesus does have the path to true happiness. That doesn't mean that you and I are practicing it. And I think part of that is that we also live in a culture of social media, and that stimulates within us this comparison trap, right? I mean, you've been there and I've been there. It's easy to get online and see, oh, look, they're at the beach again. Oh, look, he bought a new car. Oh, look, she got that new whatever. Look at them drive that, or they got that new, and it's so easy to get kind of sucked into this culture of more, and I need this, and look how the Jones, and I don't mean this like Jones in our church, but, to keep up with the Jones, and I love the Jones in our church, by the way, but to keep up the Jones family, because that's a saying, right? So let's look at Matthew chapter 6, and let's kind of break this apart and talk about why Jesus has the path to true happiness. Now, we began last year going through the beginning of the Sermon of the Mount. And on the beginning of the Sermon of the Mount, which was one of Jesus' favorite famous sermons, there's two of them, the Sermon on the Mount of Olives and the Sermon on the Mount, he lines out 9 ways we're supposed to be happy. In fact, you can go back to our website, rivercast.com/live, click on the Boxcast link, go back to last January, and we talk about 9 ways that Jesus determines that we can be happy. After this sermon, he actually gets to the whole discussion that we find in Matthew chapter 6, where he talks about this recipe for happiness. And this is what he says, Matthew 6:19 through 20. You've heard this before. This is kind of famous verse alert, so here we go. Verse 19, don't store up treasures here on earth where moths eat them and rusts destroy them and where thieves break in and steal. Store your treasures in heaven. So there's this idea of saving for something. Now, it sounds like we're adding something to some sort of future part where I get to benefit some sort of future eternal IRA, right? That's what I'm doing. I'm investing for the future. But really, in heaven, that was a metaphor for in God. So what he's saying is, don't get caught up in worldly values. Get caught up in God. Store up all of your values here in God, because that's where happiness comes. Because when you store up your treasures in heaven, where moss and rust cannot destroy and thieves do not break and steal, here's what happens. Wherever your treasure is, there will the desires of your heart will be also. So we're going to come back to this, but after Jesus has said this, we're going to get into this idea of a treasure and desires of your heart and kind of break this apart. But then he goes on to say something kind of cryptic. And it's not something I've completely understood, but as I've done some study, I kind of got a little bit of grasp on it, so let's pick this apart. Jesus goes on to say this: your eye is a lamp that provides light for your body. When your eye is good, your whole body is filled with light. But when your eye is bad, your whole body is filled with darkness, and the light you think you have is actually darkness. How deep is that darkness? I mean, what is Jesus talking about? He's just talked about this, storing things up eternally. I don't really get that. What does that mean? Do I not do anything or own anything? What does he mean by that? Don't store up here on earth. Does that mean I can't have stuff? And then he goes into this whole thing about I and good and bad and health. Well, let's break this apart a little bit and look at it. First of all, this was a figure of speech. Jesus is saying something very common to the Jewish thought process. And the figure of speech is your eye. And a healthy eye or a good eye meant, in that figure of speech, it meant generosity. So when Jesus says your eye is a lamp that provides light to your body, when your eye is good, you're being what? You're being generous. In fact, this is the same word for generosity. And your whole body is filled with what? Generosity. But when you're unhealthy, it means just the opposite. It means you're greedy or stingy. So an unhealthy eye means that your whole lifestyle is filled with greed, or it's filled with generosity. And so if you're like me, I don't want my life filled with greed and stinginess, and as we're going to get into a moment, I want my life filled with what Jesus is teaching me is the true path to happiness, which is generosity, which is contentment, which is satisfaction. So what Jesus is doing is he's saying there's two mindsets. There are two things that we focus on. We can focus on this healthy eye, which is the eye of generosity, or we can focus on this mindset that's unhealthy, which is this mindset of greed. And he breaks it down into these two mindsets, and they are an abundant mindset and a scarcity mindset. Now, this goes all the way back to what we talked about earlier. When I said that your family of origin, and I said that your emotional state about generosity, and it's about how you're raised and your social status and maybe some of the church teaching, this affects your mindset. You may not realize it does, but as you begin to break this apart and begin to kind of think internally about this, what do I really value? You begin to realize that you have one of these two mindsets. And that's what Jesus is doing with this whole I figure of speech. You either have an abundant mindset, because what's coming into your eyes and in your thought is producing this mindset that's controlling your body, and you can think about nothing that God is a God of abundance, and God is the provider, and I can trust God, and I know that God is going to come through for me, or you have this scarcity mindset. So let's break both of these down and let's talk about it. First of all, the abundance mindset is that, you know what? I don't have to worry. God's going to take care of me. There's quotes by Jesus about why do the birds worry, the lilies of the field don't worry, so why should I worry? So there's this attitude that God is my provider, that God is going to come through for me, that God is going to meet my needs, that God is always going to be there for me. And I live in this world where God has provided not only this abundance of grace, but this abundance of his gifts. And so you kind of look at the world thinking, you know what? This is a gift from God. God has provided me with all this, and there's this attitude, and that's what affects the way you focus. And then there's this scarcity mindset. And the scarcity mindset produces just the opposite. There's no God, there's no provider, And so there's this unhealthy eye, and there's the attitude or the belief that maybe there's a possible future loss of something. Like I could lose what I own. There's not enough to go around. There's not enough in the world. There's not enough resources. I'm not getting enough money. I'm not living off enough. I never seem to have enough. And there's this scarcity mindset. And you begin to believe that, you know what, I am on my own. I've got to make my own happiness. I do not or will not ever have enough. And this is the light and darkness that Jesus is talking about. We focus on an abundance mindset. It's healthy. The light produces this attitude that God, who is the light, is going to provide for my needs. The scarcity mindset produces sort of this darkness where we get these three contrasting feelings about money. And maybe you felt this way: fear, greed, or stinginess. Fear, greed, or stinginess are the three primary feelings that most people struggle with when it comes to money. The hard part about this is identifying that I have fear, or that I am greedy, or that I am stingy. Because if you compare yourself to the rest of the world, you think, well, I'm not as greedy as them, or I'm not as stingy as them, or I have more faith than they do. And it's really not about that. It's evaluating your own life and your own heart and your own commitment. Greed, obviously, is a desire for more. It's more than what you have. It produces a feeling of covetousness, where you envy what others have, or you become jealous of what you don't have and they have. Fear is this attitude that produces this mentality that what I have I could lose, and so I either need to hoard it, right, or I need to protect it in some sort of way, and what I have could be taken away. Or maybe over time, your family of origin, your church background, and your emotional feelings about money have produced this attitude of stinginess. Now, this is where I resonate. I've never really dealt with a lot of fear because as growing up, my family did provide for my needs. I always had a place to live and some air conditioning and some food to eat, and, you know, I could take a shower and that kind of stuff and wash my clothes. While I felt like I didn't have enough compared to some other people, I didn't really have a fear because my father and my mother, they took care of me. Greed, I didn't know what greed was because the people that I ran with. But stinginess, oh yeah. Stinginess was a big part of my growing up, and I didn't realize it until later in my adulthood. Stinginess is a selfish desire to keep everything for myself. This is mine. And it's almost that toddler attitude as we see teaching our granddaughter Daisy to share with her little sister Alice. She's struggling now because Alice wants to play with what Daisy has. And what are we teaching? We're teaching her how to share. And when you're stingy, you don't want to share. You want to keep stuff for yourself. You don't really realize that until somebody does what? They touch your toy. They touch your stuff. They want what you have. And there's this feeling of protection. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't be responsible for the stuff you have and you shouldn't be a good steward of what you own, but a scarcity mindset results in becoming enslaved to fear or enslaved to greed and enslaved to stinginess. And over time, it produces a darkness in your life that keeps you from being generous. It keeps you from being content. It keeps you from trusting that God is going to provide. And so instead of giving it away or even having or wanting to have a plan for giving what you have away, the extra, the stuff that you've been given, the money that you've been giving, what do? You hoard it. You keep it for yourself. You get upset because other people have more than you. You are scared that it's going to be taken away. And these are the three primary feelings. So, to review, an abundant mindset results in three things: confidence, contentment, and generosity. And a scarcity mindset results in fear, greed, and stinginess. So, do you want fear or confidence? Do you want to be greedy or content? Do you want to be stingy or generous? And that's the kind of question we have to begin to ask ourselves as we get into this series. Am I fearful, or do I trust God to provide? Am I greedy for more, or am I content with what I have? Am I stingy, or am I generous? And the word generosity kind of encompasses all of it. It kind of brings it up under an umbrella of thought. So, which of these scarcity mindsets affects you now? Now, again, we don't realize how much of our American culture has affected us. We don't understand this and we don't see that because there are three major philosophies driving everything that happens around us. There's hedonism, there's materialism, and narcissism. And these are like big preaching topics. They're the isms, right? They're philosophies that are undergirding kind of the driving mentality of American culture. American culture is driven to pleasure, and actually John talked about this. We struggle with the lust of the flesh. I want what makes me feel good. I want what gets me through a moment of grief or stress or whatever. I need one more hit, one more drink, one more opportunity to go out and find some way to fulfill some sort of lust that I have. And then there's materialism. And that comes from what John said in John chapter 2, the lust of the eyes. We are provoked and we're put in front of us this culture of more. And so this philosophy undergirding things becomes this animated kind of thing, which we're going to get into in a moment. And then there's this idea of narcissism. You know, this is my stuff, and I've worked hard for this, and I made this happen. This is my car, and my house, and my vacation, and my time, and I deserve all of this stuff. And narcissism eventually produces a lack of confidence and trust in God because you are so confident that you can take care of you, you don't need God to take care of you. That's where we get the mindsets that I can only trust and rely on myself. So, here's the key question. As we move forward through this series and talk about generosity, and this, believe me, this is preaching to me as much as it is preaching to you. How do I combat stinginess, greed, and fear in my own life? How do I combat that? If I live in a culture of hedonism, materialism, and narcissism, how do I combat those three desires that are always going to push against my sinful nature, stinginess, greed, and fear, with generosity, contentment, and confidence in God? Because if Jesus said, it is more blessed to give than to receive, then what Jesus is implying is that generosity, contentment, and confidence in God produces more happiness. It's more blessed, more wealth, more contentment, more satisfaction. The satisfied person is content. The fulfilled person is confident in God. And Jesus gives us the answer to this. And guess what? It's not found in better budgeting. It's not found in some sort of, which is good. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not found in minimalism. We're not asking you to give things away or become some sort of ascetic monk where you live with like one shirt and one pair of underwear and a robe and you're walking around shaving the middle of your head because you're practicing this sort of, I don't have anything and that's the way I should live. It's not that. It's not some sort of self-help. Instead, Jesus goes on to say at the end of this chapter, after he's talked about this cryptic thing about the eye, he's talked about treasures in heaven, and all these metaphors and figures of speech that we don't get, here's what it boils down to. No one can serve two masters. Now, you're sitting at home, you're listening to me, you're probably quiet, if the kids aren't, be quiet, but I want you to say this with me. Ready? Everybody say no one. Ready? No one. Everybody say no one. No one. Everybody say no one. No one. Not me, nobody, not you. We can't fix this within ourselves. There is nothing we can do living in the culture we live in and struggling with the issues that we have that can fix this. We need the power of Jesus, the power of the Holy Spirit living within us to transform us, to move us toward generosity, to move us to help us take a step toward contentment, to move us toward trusting God with our resources. We can't sort this out. We can't figure this out. We can't work this out. My fleshly desires are always going to be affected by worldly temptations and things that I struggle with personally. So left unchecked, this is just like a car that's going to go on that's going to become unaligned. You're going to have to get the tires lined up. It's just going to get out of order if you don't pay attention to it. And so it's really interesting in this because as we read the rest of this verse, and I'm going to read it, I want to point something out and how Jesus breaks this down for us. First, he says, no one can serve two masters, for you will hate the one and you'll love the other. You can't serve a scarcity mindset and abundance mindset. You're going to be devoted to one and despise the other, and you're going to be enslaved to one and not enslaved to the other. And he's going on to say, you can't do this without practicing some sort of discipline in your life and allowing God to transform this part of your heart. You cannot serve both God and mammon. Now, the word here, mammon, is usually translated money, and you might have a translation that uses that. The original word is an Aramaic word. For instance, when Matthew translated what Jesus said into Greek, what you have is this whole sentence, which has been translated for us into English, written in the original Greek. So when you go back and read Matthew, it's Greek, Greek, Greek. So if you counted these words, you'd find Greek, Greek word, Greek word, Greek word, Greek word. But then you get to this word mammon. And the word mammon is an Aramaic word. Now, why did Matthew not go ahead and translate that for us from Aramaic? Because Jesus was speaking Aramaic, but Matthew is writing what Jesus said in Greek because that was the common language that you read anything in. Because the word mammon actually has to do with the god, the Syrian god of money. And so Jesus is actually saying here that you can't serve both God and another god, an animated god of wealth. In other words, you can't figure this out. You can't sort this out. And Aramaic, the word mammon, the Syrian god of wealth, Jesus is naming money as a spiritually animated rival god. Now, why is that important? The reason why that is so important is because we like to think of money as a neutral thing. And we're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks. You know, it's the love of money that's the root of all evil. And we like to think, well, money's not evil. Having money's not evil. It's the love of money that's evil, or it's the greed that's evil, right? But while that is true, it's naive. But while we want to believe that money is neutral, it's really actually animated. And left unchecked, wealth, while being morally neutral, and there's nothing wrong with money or having money or providing for your family or the possession of money. However, when money begins to control us, that's when the trouble starts. When money begins to affect the way we think about how we decide what we do and how we live and how we give to the kingdom, that's when the trouble starts. Money is neutral, but Jesus is saying, by saying you can't serve both God and mammon or the Syrian god of wealth, it can become sinfully animated by our flesh, by our eyes, and by the world. That's why we have to keep this in check. Just like any other morally neutral desire, a desire for food becomes gluttony, or a desire for sex becomes immorality, or a desire for leadership becomes power, or a desire for comforts become greed or stinginess, or stealing even. We have to keep a morally neutral desire in check because left unchecked, it becomes animated by evil. That's why he's calling it mammon. You can't serve both God and mammon. You've got to practice this in your life, or this is going to take over. Now, it's taken me a long time to understand this, and I'm still trying to understand it, but I love what John Mark Comer says. He says that transforming my desires from fear to confidence in God, from greed to contentment, and stinginess to generosity is the task of discipleship. And that's what this series is all about. It's about practicing generosity, just like practicing prayer or practicing scripture or practicing witnessing or practicing community, all the things that help me in my faith, all the things that when I practice them, I become a fully devoted, follower of Jesus. I become better at life because I'm following Jesus, right? When I practice generosity, that's what happens in my life. I begin to experience more trust in God. I begin to experience what it means to be content. And I begin to experience what it means to combat my personal struggle with stinginess, with generosity. So, here is the takeaway. Here's what I want you to leave knowing today as we kick off this series. To become generous, we've got to practice generosity. I mean, think about this as it applies to anything. To become a better weightlifter, I've got to lift more weights. To become better at running, I've got to run more, right? To become a better person who understands a different language, I've got to practice that different language. To become generous, you don't just become generous because it's a one-time transaction or a time during Christmas where you do some sort of random act of kindness. And while that's good, in order to combat that consistently in life and to see that needle move toward discipleship in your life, you've got to become generous by practicing generosity. And so I'm convinced that one of the core tasks of following Jesus is discovering this practice of generosity, working it into the culture of our life and the rhythm of our decision making. Let it affect how we budget, how we decide what we do with our money, what we do with our time, what we do with our resources. Let it affect us because there is a joy. Jesus said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. More blessed. And listen, I want in my life discover this feeling that Jesus is talking about. I want to discover the joy of generosity, and I know you want that too. Generosity is not just right, it's the pathway to happiness. Why is it the pathway to happiness? Because Jesus said it is. Materialism is not just wrong, it's the pathway to enslavement, to fear, to greed, and to stinginess. And you know what? I bet you did not want to kick off the year being enslaved to fear, greedy, and stinginess. I mean, is there anybody out there who said, you know what I'd really like to do is I'd like to be more greedy, I'd like to be more stingy, and I would like to be less content, and I'd like to have more fear where I can't trust things and have more anxiety. Nobody wants that. You kicked off 2025 thinking about maybe some sort of something you're going to do to improve something in your life, and this is a step. Everybody wants to experience the better that God promises, and this is a promise of Jesus. It is better, Makarios, to give than to receive. This is a promise that when you give, you experience the pleasure and the joy of giving. So I want to be free, I want to be better, I want to be happy in 2025. Let's kind of end with a small challenge because this is a baby step. As I stepped into the gym this week, talking about, I used to work out more, but this year was kind of a hard year and just didn't work out. And, I did the thing that I do. Instead of when I get stressed, some of you take pills, I go to the pantry. That's how I deal with stress in my life. And so I realized, to relieve some stress in my life, I need to go to the gym. But if you have this thing you do when you go back to the gym, you're like, where do I start? I know what to do. And so it's kind of all in my brain. And then you have so many ideas. And because your brain is kind of going crazy, you go in there and your wife says, well, what'd you do? Well, I didn't really do anything because I didn't have a plan. We've got to have some sort of step that we begin to take where we begin to incrementally work generosity into our life. Because if it's true, to become generous, I've got to practice generosity, that I've got to take baby steps. I've got to be that toddler pulling myself up and traveling along the couch and finding my footing, right, as I understand how generosity is supposed to play out in my life. And I really, truly want this. So this is my challenge to you. Give something away this week. Just something small, something extra. And don't give it to your family because that's easy. That's easy. I mean, my daughter or my sons call me up and say, I need something. I'm there. All right? That's done. I want to look for ways that I can have these opportunities to give something to someone in need. One of the things that I do usually in town, and I don't do this all the time, but I always know kind of now when I'm getting on 400 where the people who need stuff are. And I never give them money, but if Lee and I buy a sandwich, I always buy an extra sandwich. And when you pull up to that stop sign and that guy's looking at you, holding up that sign, I hand them the extra sandwich. Give somebody something away this week. It's just a small step, a small practice. Maybe you want to take $25, and I mean cash, stick it in your pocket, and look for a way to use it. Or maybe you set it aside in your budget, and you pass it along. You see somebody, at Starbucks. You buy their meal. You buy somebody else's meal. You see a woman or a man, fighting her kids at Walmart, and you offer to do something that is challenging to you. You give something away. Maybe you need to go in your closet. This week, I saw someone on my post say they didn't have clothes for winter. And I was looking in our closet the other day, and I got 3 or 4 jackets. I got jackets for different occasions. You've got a jacket you can give away. And I don't mean a crap jacket, like a jacket you don't want anymore. I mean like a nice jacket. And you need to take a step and give that jacket away. I don't know how God is going to lead you in this, but it's up to you to kind of tune into this, to see this. And as you begin the day, maybe in prayer you say, God, just open the door today for me to see something I can give away. And it may not happen on Monday, it may happen on Thursday. So ask God every day. And so we're changing how the world tells us to see life, right? The lens of our eye, from an unhealthy eye to a healthy eye, from a stingy and a fearful and a greedy eye to a content eye, to an eye of generosity and an eye of giving. From me, mine, I want this, I need that, to give away, to donate, to help, to serve, to invest, to provide for others. This is the goal of talking about what Jesus talks about. And as we move forward, and as we barely dip our toes in the teachings of Jesus on generosity, I pray that you remember the words of the Lord Jesus. It is more blessed to give than to receive. It is more blessed to give than receive. Repeat that with me at home. It is more blessed to give than to receive. In fact, maybe this week, your challenge is to memorize that. Acts 20:35. It is more blessed to give than receive. Put that in your notes. Post that on Facebook. Post it on your Instagram. Make some sort of, you can go online, and I'm sure you can find Bible verses with this on it. And this becomes kind of the mantra of how you're starting to incrementally add these little small baby steps of generosity. Now, again, I don't have all this figured out. I'm not the most generous person in the world. This is something that I have caught more than has been taught to me. And so as we grow together, I pray that God will begin to show you the joy of generosity. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for this time. God, and while the weather's bad outside, I thank you that we can still use the miracle of multimedia and live stream to come together and to study your word and to study what you have to teach us. As we move through this series on generosity, I know that there are going to be barriers of emotions, of teaching, of feelings that we have about money, and it's going to feel awkward. And we're going to think that this was all a ploy to get more and to give more. It's really about adjusting how we think and how we feel to the path of happiness and what Jesus has taught us. That's what I want in my life, God. I know that's what other people truly want in their life who are following Jesus. We ask these things in Jesus' name, amen. Before we close out today, first of all, I want to say thanks for hanging out with me today. You gave some time to me today, and I appreciate that. And you're going to probably be like me. You're going to take a nap in this cold weather, eat some chili, grilled cheese. That's what I'm looking forward to. So go ahead and get that started at home, Lee. But anyway, as we move forward, here's a couple of announcements real quick. Let me move into the announcement slide section so I can find those. Here's some upcoming events that are happening in our church real quick. The Practicing the Way course. You've heard us talk about that. In fact, if you watched this online, December 29th, that was a video of the group who had actually piloted that course. And what we did was we piloted that course with about 12 people to see if this is something we want to offer to the whole church. And resoundingly, it came back absolutely yes. If you've been a follower of Jesus your whole life and you've heard everything there is to hear, trust me, there is some great, brand new, fresh material on getting you started in 2025 about practicing the way of Jesus. This is a course on spiritual growth, spiritual practices. It's going to begin we're going to meet on Wednesday nights at 7:30, and we're going to do it by Zoom. So you don't have to go anywhere. You can sit there in your pajamas if you want to. You can turn the camera off and just listen. Listen to the videos, listen to the discussion. There's homework. You can do homework or not do homework. You can read more. And as much as you want to get out of this, you can get out of it. Listen, everybody who's been through this says this is one of the best, and I believe the best classes on spiritual practices. This is a great way to kick off 2024. So text me, post it, contact me if you want to go through this class, because we need to get you a workbook, okay? So let me know. Also, coming at the end of this month, we're going to be having a first step lunch. And if you're new to the river, you've been coming a while, you've been coming for 4 or 5 months, and you're thinking, okay, what's my next step? Or what's my first step? We're going to provide a free lunch for you where you get to sit down and hear stories from other people who've been part of our church and just hear about the ministries of our church. You get to ask questions about what we believe. We're not going to ask you to do anything. It's just a lunch for you to ask questions and to hear stories, and this is your first step. So RSVP for a free lunch. You can email me at office@riverks.com. Contact me and let me know. And I need some ladies or people to help me with this lunch if you're willing to do that. That's going to be a Sunday, January the 26th. I think that's all I got. I'm going to put my 4x4, and I'm going to drive slowly home and go outside and take off that snow and that ice off my truck. And you are going to take that blanket, you're going to pull it up, you're going to hang out, you're going to find that streaming show you're going to watch or that football game or take that nap or eat that chili or whatever you're going to do. But hey, I hope you have a great day. And I hope I see you next Sunday, right? It's been 2 weeks since we had church, and this is starting to feel a little bit like COVID or something crazy. So thanks for joining us. God bless you guys. Love you all. Look forward to seeing you soon.